Anna remembered the first time she held Nick in her arms, so small, so fragile. Yet even then she knew he would be the most important part of her life. She had been only 19, barely an adult herself, but the weight of responsibility had settled on her shoulders. In a way, she hadn't been prepared for everything. About those early years had been a struggle. Nick's father, Eric, had never been a stable presence. At first she had believed he could be. He had promised so much, whispered reassurances into the quiet of their tiny apartment, kissed Nick's forehead, and vowed he would do better. But promises didn't keep the lights on. Reassurances didn't fill an empty fridge. Eric had always meant well, she supposed. He just wasn't built for fatherhood for. The crushing weight of a life where other people depended on him. He had lost himself in gambling, in the desperate thrill of a why that never lasted. The cycle had been endless: late nights, borrowed money, hollow apologies. At first, she had believed him when he said things would change. But the Leah only stretched so far before it broke. When Nick turned 12, she finally packed their bags. It hadn't been easy. She remembered that night vividly, how she had stood in the dim glow of the kitchen light, watching Eric sleep on the couch, his face slack with exhaustion. He hadn't even stirred, as she carried their belongings ass. She pulled Nick's hand into hers and led him into the night we're leaving. He had asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Yes, sweetheart," she had whispered, squeezing. Fingers we are, and they had the years that followed had been hard, but they had been theirs. She had worked tirelessly, moving from job to job, clawing her way towards something that felt like stability. Eventually she managed to buy a small sea cafe on the outskirts of town, a modest place, nothing glamorous, but it was hers. It kept food on the table and a roof over their heads. Nick had never complained, even when she was too busy to sit with him for dinner, even when she came home exhausted, smelling of coffee and baked bread. He'd grown into a quiet, thoughtful young man, his shoulders broadening, his voice deepening. Sometimes she looked at him and saw glimpses of the baby she had rocked to sleep, the boy who had clung to her hand so tightly that day. She noticed something different about him. It was late when he came home, later than usual. He dropped his backpack by the door and sat at the kitchen table, running a hand through his dark hair, his posture tense. She had been rinsing dishes, but at the sight of him, she turned off the faucet, drying her hands before walking over. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly, sliding into the chair across from him. "Long day." Nick hesitated for a moment. It seemed like he wasn't sure whether to answer. But then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mom," he paused, his brows furrowing. "I don't know what to do." She kept her voice gentle about what there was. Another moment of silence before he exhaled, shifting in his seat. "There's this girl," he admitted. "I like her. And today she kissed me." Anna's lips twitched into a small smile, but she kept it soft, sensing the unease in his voice. "That doesn't sound like a bad thing." "No, it's not," he said quickly, then frowned. "But I froze. I didn't know what to do. And now I feel like I messed it up. What if she thinks I don't like her back? What if she reached across the table, resting her hand over his neck?" She interrupted gently. "It's okay." His finger twitched under hers, restless, uncertain. "I was just so nervous," he muttered. "I don't want to do something wrong. I don't want to mess up." Anna squeezed his hand, the corners of her myth-lifting. "Sweetheart, confidence doesn't mean always knowing what to do. It means being present, learning, and trusting yourself." She studied him for a moment. "Would you like some advice?" Nick hesitated, then nodded. She leaned back. "Thoughtful understanding comes with experience," she said. "And experience comes with practice." His brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Anna tilted her head slightly. "You mean confidence isn't something you wake up with one day, it's something you build." She tapped her fingers lightly on that. How about we work on that? Nick blinked at her work on confidence. Yes, she said simply. You trust me, don't you? Of course I do, she smiled. Then trust me when I say you're going to be fine, and I think I know where we can start. Nick looked at her wearily. Start what she stood, moving toward the counter. Where her purse rested, she pulled out her car keys and turned to face him. Come on. Nick frowned. Where are we going? You'll see. He groaned, standing. Reluctantly. Mom, seriously. What are we doing? She laughed, nudging him toward the door. Teaching. Something important about what she smiled knowingly as she stepped outside, into the cool evening air. About confidence she didn't tell him where they were going. And to his credit, Nick didn't ask again. After the first few times, she brushed off his questions with a simple you'll see. He just sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring out the window as the glow of streetlights passed in intervals over his face. He had always been quiet, but tonight there was a restlessness in the way he shifted. In his seat, his fingers tapping absently against his knee, she could still see the remnants of uncertainty in his expression, the way he kept running a hand through his hair. He was thinking, too much caught up in his own self-doubt, overanalyzing every word, every movement. She reached over and squeezed his hand briefly before returning it to the wheel. Relax. She said, You're not on trial. Nick huffed a small laugh. Feels like it. They drove for another 10 minutes before she finally pulled into a small parking lot in front of a boutique shop. The lights inside were dim, the glow of candles flickering in the windows, the scent of something warm and familiar, a mix of lavender and vanilla, greeted them as she pushed open the door. Nick gave her a skeptical look. A candle store. Not just candles. She said, walking deeper inside, the store was filled with shelves of small glass bottles, delicate ceramic dishes, soft fabrics, the music. Playing was slow and calming, barely more than a whisper in the background. She led him to a section near the back, running her fingers over a row of small, neatly labeled bottles before selecting one and handing it to him. Nick turned it over in his hands. Confused. Massage oil. She nodded. Touch is important. It's one of the ways we communicate even when we don't realize it. People think confidence is just about words, but it's also about presence, about how you move, how you respond. Nick looked at the bottle, like it might explode. And this helps. How you'll see, she said again. Taking it from him and heading to the counter, the drive home was quieter. Nick didn't ask any more questions, but she could tell his mind was turning, trying to put together whatever it was she was trying to teach him. She waited, giving him time to settle into his thoughts. It wasn't until they were back in the house, the door shut behind them, that Heffenly spoke. Okay, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. What now? She smiled, setting the bottle on the coffee table. Now you learn. He frowned. Learn what? She gestured for him to sit on the couch, and after a moment's hesitation, he did. She turned on soft music, the same kind they'd heard in the store, the kind that filled the room with warmth. Then she sat beside him, unscrewing the cap of the bottle and pouring a small amount into her hands. Confidence starts with awareness. She said, of yourself, of the people around you, of the way you move and the way others respond to you. Nick watched her, still unsure. Okay. She reached for his hand, her fingers sliding over his palm. His shoulders stiffened slightly before he exhaled, letting himself relax. She guided his hand up, word pressing his fingers against her wrist. Feel that. He nodded. Your pulse. That's right, she said softly. It tells you something. That's what touches. It's a way of feeling, of knowing when you hesitate, when you overthink, you miss things. You miss the way someone reacts, the way their body responds to yours. She guided his hand higher, pressing it against her shoulder. His fingers were warm, his touch still hesitant, but he didn't pull away. Confidence isn't just acting like you know what you're doing, she continued. It's listening. Paying attention, Nick swallowed. This feels weird, she smiled, because you're thinking too much. His jaw clenched slightly, but he didn't argue. He'll let her move his hand again. Let her show him how to focus, how to be aware of the space between them. His breathing slowed, the tension in his shoulders easing. Just a little she could feel it in the way. His touch grew steady. More assured there, she said. See, you're already learning. Nick looked at her. Then something unreadable in his expression. I guess she let go of his hand and sat back watching him try it yourself. He hesitated before, reaching out his fingers, brushing over her arm. Light at first, then firmer. When he saw that she didn't pull away, she let him explore the movement. Let him find his own rhythm. Good, she murmured. His fingers traced along the curve of her wrist, slower, now more deliberate. She could feel the change in him, the way his breathing deepened, the way the uncertainty began to fade. It was a small shift, but an important one. She turned slightly, catching his gaze now. Tell me, what'd you notice? He was quiet for a long moment. His eyes flickered over her face, lingering on the places where his touch had landed. You're relaxed, he said finally, and he swallowed. But you weren't. First, she smiled exactly. They sat there, for a few more moments. The air between them charged with something unspoken. She could see the way he was thinking, the way he was processing everything she had. Told him this wasn't about teaching him a trick, about giving him a set of steps to follow. It was about learning to trust himself, to stop second-guessing every move. Nick let out a slow breath, shaking his head with a quiet laugh. This is a weird lesson, Mom. She laughed too, nudging his shoulder. You'll thank me later, Harold. His eyes. But she could see the tension in him had lifted. He wasn't thinking about his mistakes anymore. He wasn't caught up in what he should have done or what he might do next. He was present, and that was the first step. Nick sat back against the couch, rubbing his palms together as if trying to shake off the weight of the lesson. His shoulders were still a little tense, but she could see the shift in his expression. He was thinking, processing, letting it settle in. She watched him, quietly waiting. He always took his time with things, never rushing to speak until he was sure of what he wanted to say. Finally, he let out a slow breath. So, that's it. She smiled, shaking her head. Not quite. His brow furrowed. There's more. There's always more, she said simply. But I think you're starting to get it. Hicks hailed again, dragging a hand through his hair. I don't know, Mom. I get what you're saying. But this still feels I don't know. Like it won't help. She tilted her head, slightly studying him. What are you afraid of? He frowned. I'm not afraid. She raised an eyebrow. Nick sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I guess. I just don't want to look stupid or mess it up. You're going to mess up, she said, simply. That's part of it. No one gets everything right all the time. But confidence isn't about perfection. It's about trust. He let that sit for a moment, then finally nodded, though. He still looked unconvinced. She reached for the small bottle on the table again, turning it over in her hands. Come here, she said. Nick hesitated, then shifted. Closer, shepherded a small amount of the oil into her hands, warming it between her palms before reaching for his wrist. He stiffened slightly at first, but let her guide his arm. You can learn a lot about a person just by touch, she murmured. The way they react, the way they hold tension, what puts them at ease. Nick swallowed, but didn't say anything. She ran her fingers lightly along his forearm, letting the oil smooth the motion. If someone stiffens, you slow down. If they lean in, you continue. It's about reading what isn't being said. She guided his hand to her own arm, watching as he hesitated before pressing his fingers against her skin. His movements were slow. Careful, trust yourself, she murmured. Don't overthink it. He nodded, adjusting his grip slightly. His touch became steadier, more assured. She could feel the shift in his energy, the way he was, letting himself relax into the moment, instead of analyzing every second. "See," she said softly, "you're doing fine." Nick let out a breath, his fingers trailing lightly along the curve of her wrist before pulling away. That felt different. She smiled because you weren't thinking, you were just present. He nodded slowly, then glanced up at her, something uncertain in his expression. "Mom?" She tilted her head. "Yeah." He hesitated. "Do you ever think about yourself?" She blinked at this sudden shift in conversation. "What do you mean?" Nick shrugged. "You spend so much time worrying about me, making sure I'm okay, teaching me all this stuff, but what about you?" She felt a strange tightness in her chest at his words. "You always tell me to be confident, to go after what I want, to trust myself. But do you?" She opened her mouth, but no answer came. Nick gave her a small, knowing smile. "Maybe it's time you do the same." She let out of breath, shaking her head with a soft laugh. "Maybe you're right." He grinned. "I usually am." She rolled her eyes but couldn't stop herself from smiling. The room was quiet for a moment, the air between them filled with something warm and unspoken. Tonight had been important for him. And maybe for her too. The night stretched on the house, settling into its familiar silence. But Anna felt something lingering in the air between them. Something neither of them had words for yet. Nick still sat beside her, fingers tapping absently against his knee the way they always did when he had too much on his mind. She had watched him do it since he was a boy, back when his biggest worries were spelling tests and scraped knees. Now his worries were different, heavier, and she couldn't fix them the way she used to. All she could do was guide him, help him see what was already inside him. Nick shifted his brow, furrowing slightly. "Do you ever regret it?" She turned toward him. Surprised regret, what he exhaled, staring at his hands. "Leaving Dad. Everything that happened after." For a moment she didn't answer. It wasn't that she hadn't thought about it. Of course she had. There had been nights when she lay awake wondering if she had done the right thing, if she had made the right choices, but then she would look at Nick, at the person he was becoming, and the doubts would fade. "No," she said. "Finally, I don't regret it." Nick glanced up at her, searching her face. Not even a little. She hesitated. "I regret that. It had to be that way. I regret that. He couldn't be the person we needed him to be, but I don't regret choosing you. I'd make the same choice 100 times over." He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded as if something had settled inside him. "I get it." She reached over, brushing his hair back the way she used to when he was younger. He made a face, but pull away. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, Nick," she said softly. "You just have to live. Learn, make mistakes, figure it out as you go." He sighed. "That's the scary part." She smiled. "It always is." They sat there for a while, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the quiet. Eventually Nick stood, stretching. "I think I'm going to go to bed." She nodded. "Get some rest." He hesitated before leaning down, pressing a quick kiss to the top of her head. "Thanks, Mom." Her heart ached in the best way as she watched him walk down the hall to his room. She stayed where she was, staring at the dimly lit kitchen, thinking about everything they had talked about all the years that had led them here. Nick was growing up, becoming his own person, and she had done her job. But for the first time in a long time, she wondered what came next for her. She had spent so many years making sure he was okay. Maybe it was time to make sure she was too.